This program deals with devil worship and satanic beliefs. It contains explicit scenes and descriptions of violent crimes and rituals.
Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
You have declared a subliminal jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
And night fell on a different world.
And Iblis is thinking, I should be getting this position, not Adam, and this guy is created from dirt.
And how does the army feel about you being head of the Temple of Set?
And the conspiracy theorists can say what they will, but
I want you to give me power over Adam. And I want you to give me soldiers and minions and all of these things.
The people have so much to gain and have such an ulterior motive for putting me in a position I'm in. They'll never let the true facts some of their boys to the world.
And I want you to be able to give me the ability to whisper into the hearts of mankind.
And who was the grotto leader?
I don't remember his name.
You don't remember the name of a person who involved you in murder?
Now these people are very happy with this, yes.
Welcome back to Subliminal Jihad, episode 64. I am your co-host, Dimitri.
I'm Khalid.
And today, this is a pretty big day for Subliminal Jihad, I think.
Yeah. Let's try to not make it 8 hours long. Let's try to not spend an entire work day talking about this subject. This is,
all right. I can sense that you want to keep it.
Yeah, well, obviously we tend to have long episodes, but I just have a sense, this is for you, a big subject, something that you're, very invested in, yeah, so I feel that, just putting it out there, let's try not to have it be, 12 hours or whatever,
all right. Well, I see that you found I see that you found a place to make your stand, but take it easy. All right.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
It's gonna be fine.
Mm-hmm.
It's gonna be fine.
Okay.
That's a quote, actually.
Yeah.
That's a quote from our subject today.
Yes, I know.
This is a band that we've brought up a number of times, as you said, probably mostly due to my curious obsession in the last several years with this American rock and roll
I'm actually
group.
not a big connoisseur of, or really I didn't really know much about them at all, and I hadn't listened to them. I couldn't have told you really before a couple days ago that Take It Easy was by the Eagles, or Take It to the Limit. If you asked me to sing that, I couldn't have actually done so. I knew Hotel California, that's kind of it.
Yeah. And yes, that we are talking about who else? The Eagles. And I think it's an interesting topic to cover, because on the one hand, given all the fringy topics we cover on this show, maybe a new listener might come and say why the hell are you going to talk about the Eagles for 4.5 hours? I'm just kidding, not 4. But for a couple hours,
you say
why are you
going to
talk about the
that
Eagles?
Seems actually plausible. Anyway.
Well, I think it is something we brought up. It's something I've tweeted about a lot over the periodically, I think, over the last couple years, and tweeted what felt like some relatively hot takes about the Eagles, because I don't know, I've gone through periods of, unlike you, I grew up in California, so this is a basic part of my ambient soundtrack growing up on the radio, and what my dad would listen to when I would drive around in the car with him. And it was just always there. And it's almost like you didn't even really consider, the Eagles were just ubiquitous. It wasn't even a question of whether you liked them or not. They just were all over the place. And I think also when I was a kid, it was when they reunited in the 90s and had this huge, big tour. And at that point, they were always embodied to me. They were the ultimate, boomer dad rock band. Par excellence, and because even the way they dressed and looked in the 90s, they just looked like people's dads,
for sure.
basically.
Yeah. I watched a 4-hour documentary about the Eagles in preparation for this. I had a lot of footage of them post reunion, and like some of it was just like too boomery to even handle. Like it was just like the boomeriest thing I've ever seen. It was. Like,
it really was. It's kind of funny, like their insistence in the early 90s, like constantly kind of self-consciously joking about what old fogies they were when they were like in their late 40s. And it's like, well, okay, guys, like nowadays, like a Gen X rock band that was big in the 90s, like they're all 50 and like running around like wearing the same clothes they used to wear. And in some cases, they probably look healthier because they all have hired like Pilates instructors and they're all vegan now or something. You know what I mean?
Right.
But like they kind of like still had this older motto of like old dudes can't rock or something like that. Like it really, they're so in the eye of the storm of like the 60s culture and the rock and roll, you could say counterculture, that we covered at length in our Dave McGowan episodes in Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. And really like what's interesting about the Eagles in terms of like filling in, I don't know, our little historical dives is they kind of pick up where like chapter 1 of the Laurel Canyon music scene leaves off, like in the post-Manson era, and when all of these stars die at age 27, coincidentally. Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, eventually Jim Morrison, though maybe he faked his death and ran away. You really can't tell. But, and some of the members of the Eagles, like, popped up tangentially in that book. He was supposed to
become Rush Limbaugh, right? Jim Morrison, he's the son,
right? He's Rush Limbaugh,
yeah,
exactly. Well, now he finally did die.
Now he actually is dead, yeah. So,
they finally, folks, we got him.
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
But
anyway.
you know, I think it's interesting to like dive into the Eagles because after you're fully like McGowan pilled about the 60s, maybe the impulse is to look at everything in the music industry as just deeply sus. Like it probably, especially if it's coming out of the same area with a lot of the same people, the same scene basically as like the very sus LA scene. It's kind of it's like natural maybe to be suspicious of a group like the Eagles, especially because, as people often forget, like they are probably, I think, hands down the most successful American rock and roll group that has ever existed. And they, I think, were responsible for the #1 best-selling record of the 20th century, which was Eagles' Greatest Hits Volume 1, 1971 to 75, which was released like without their knowledge, like as a filler album before Hotel California, but ended up, I have a very like beat up $1 clearance bin vinyl version of that record. And I mean, there's pretty much like no skips on it. It's a pretty, you know, like go listen to that album, and I mean, they're just hitting you with like a one track after another of like country rock, ambivalent country rock perfection, I think. And I don't know why. I don't know why the Eagles started to like speak to me, but I think maybe it was after being in LA for a certain amount of time, something clicked with me in like early 2019, like before the pandemic, where I started listening to Hotel California again, and it just started hitting differently. And I started noticing, I guess, what many people a lot of people have speculated as to the sort of hidden meanings behind it. But I actually do think it probably is one of the best American rock and roll songs of the 20th century. And I think it holds up, even if it was like some kind of like occult, like Revelation of the Method psyop, which I don't fully believe it is. But I do think it has occulted meaning ingrained within it, but in a very, I think, appropriate literary way. I don't know if you would go in that hard
we should,
as I just did.
Maybe discuss some of these rumors around, you know, because that was it was a focus on some sort of satanic panic attention. The Hotel California.
It was.
You know, people said you could see Anton LaVey on the cover, you know, etc.
Which they've always denied, and I've never been convinced that it does look like somebody's there, but I've never been convinced. And there's never been any other kind of association with them and the Church of Satan or those types of people, though I think they probably interacted with some people who dabbled. They definitely like hung out with people who dabbled in like the spookier shit, because that was the whole scene that they were involved in. But I think the song is, even though they get a little bit like shifty, Don Henley particularly, who is for anybody who doesn't know, because I didn't even realize, I grew up with the Eagles, but I didn't realize like which Eagles were who, because it didn't even really occur to me like casually growing up that like there were like 4 to 5 singers in the band throughout their like one decade, and that they all basically like different ones sang lead on different tracks, which is kind of a unique, kind of interesting thing about them. They were also all like multi-instrumentalists, and it was only later where I realized, okay, that's Don Henley, who was one of the very few drummer singers to drum his way to the top in this golden age of rock and roll, along with I guess like Phil Collins and the Sus Dave Grohl, I suppose. But but to actually lead your band, like to lead a full band, not just be a solo artist and be drumming, is not easy. It is really hard.
No,
I can't imagine.
I
play a little bit of music, but that's like so far beyond what I could ever imagine doing.
Yeah, it seems tough. He seemed to be, struggling a little bit in some of the later concert footage.
Definitely in the 90s. They eventually went Grateful Dead and got like a second drummer who just like actually was drumming, and Don Henley could just like tap the drums and pretend. But but these guys like okay, so there's a few distinct, and as I dug deeper into the Eagles a couple years ago, I started to really, appreciate a lot of things about them that had kind of just like flown by, or I don't know, because there is, I think we have to mention like the elephant in the room. I mean, we've brought it up before, but the other thing that like spurred me on to sort of like embrace the Eagles was the weird kind of like hipster animosity that exists in like modern day culture. I'd say particularly with like Gen Xers and like in a trickle down kind of way, like millennials as well. And I think a lot of that could be just like how much radio play they got growing up. They were like absolutely everywhere, and maybe a lot of people got sick of a song like Hotel California or Take It Easy or Peaceful Easy Feeling. But I think a lot of it also had to do with that Big Lebowski scene, which is, it's kind of interesting how like one little scene could become such a dominant meme around this band that was like so much bigger than the Big Lebowski. But for like a younger generation, for these younger generations, it was basically like just the fact that the dude is like, oh, not the fucking Eagles, man. Like that became the first thing out of like 75% of people's mouths for a long time when you would like bring up the Eagles. And then I don't know if that just like connected with how people were already thinking. This is also during their like relatively like cringy like boomer, like we're rich boomers making $1 bazillion on this tour period. So I think they were more ripe than ever in some ways to be like poked fun at a little bit. And Don Henley like makes it a little easy to poke fun at him sometimes because he's so serious. But still, that it jumped out at me, especially in the last couple of years when I started reading more about at first like the sus like 60s kind of Laurel Canyon type scene and all the weird connections going on there, and then also like the punk rock scene, which kind of ended up really birthing like 90s alternative rock in a lot of ways. Like I think that they were, even though the 90s, your average 90s band probably was influenced by 60s and 70s music, it was like cooler to claim a lineage of either like punk rock or like metal or something along those lines, It got into the hipster mode today of like naming the most, like saying that, oh, the Melvins like influenced us, or like, Mudhoney, or like these or the Germs, like these kind of relatively obscure bands that like weren't like super, super big, but then you're like kind of in. It's like that like LCD Sound System, like Losing My Edge song. Like he doesn't mention the Eagles in that like litany, that obnoxious litany of like all the cool artists that like he listens to, that like aging hipster. And, because it's like not cool. It's clearly like not cool. And having lived in New York for a while, and you can surely attest to this, that like there's not the same like love or attention paid or anything like relating to the Eagles. They're such a quintessentially California band that I think out west, they attracted a much stronger kind of following and like an enduring kind of appreciation, whereas in New York maybe they always looked at it as a little bit like soft, like light, like substanceless, like California whatever. I mean, would you agree with that?
I mean, I honestly, like, I just didn't have like a consciousness of the Eagles, or really I did have a sense of the Big Lebowski thing from people. I knew one guy who was all about the Eagles. That's basically it. Like, other than that, I didn't really like, maybe Springsteen. It's weird because I feel like you did know Springsteen and did like Springsteen, because because I would say like
Yes.
Springsteen is maybe sort of an equivalent, someone who I heard all the time growing up, like on the East Coast. Him and Simon
Well,
Garfunkel,
exactly.
I would say,
I had family on the
Although,
East
who
Coast
I
and
did
stuff,
come
so I had
across-
roots on the East Coast, so I kind of understood the vibe of like Springsteen a little bit, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, I did like when I was in high school, like I discovered like again through my parents, I think like through my mom, like Jackson Browne. And I had Late for the Sky, which I really liked.
Great album.
And,
Great
I was
album.
actually surprised to discover that he was like the fifth Eagle, kind of. But it kind of makes
Well,
sense. 'Cause,
I think
listening
they
to
usually
their
call
music,
they usually call
know.
J.D. Souther the kind of like the sixth Eagle or something like that. Jackson Browne, I mean, he did fill in sometimes and play with them live, and he of course co-wrote. He mostly wrote "Take It Easy," which they covered into like was like
there
their
was that
first
part
hit.
of the documentary where I think Don Henley was saying like he lived like in a apartment like above Jackson Browne or like near him or something.
Oh,
He
Glenn
was,
Fry
like-
did. Yeah. They lived in Echo Park together, and he lived in the basement
There's a
beneath
really
Glenn
funny
Fry.
part where he was like, I would listen to him and he would be writing these songs on his piano and he would write a verse and then he would do a chorus and then he would do a second verse and I thought, that's how you do it, like that's how you write a song. It's like, word.
Exactly.
Parts of the song. But I could definitely, I definitely was reminded of him, and of that CD and listening to the Eagles, prepare for this episode. But
they were all
really,
part of that second generation of LA kind of country folk singers that followed the first gen of like the Laurel Canyon people. Like this is like post Manson, and also I think I want to say the first artist I think signed by this young hotshot from New York who was just a lowly, I think, William Morris talent scout named David Geffen. I believe Jackson Browne was his first client. And then he started basically a small record label called Asylum Records, which, that name, interesting name.
Exactly. They're saying like it's going to be a safe place for artists. Like, what's this whole thing? But it definitely
like seeking asylum, but like that's not how I always interpreted it.
Exactly.
Like this is where the crazy artists go, so we can lock them up in the Hotel California State Hospital.
That's not your first association with the word asylum. It always seems like obviously we still have the phrase seeking asylum, but. An asylum literally does mean like a safe place, but most people think of like a mental institution that's like draconian in some way,
which as we'll get into a little bit in like the biography of like the 70s and their life on the road, like it did increasingly resemble like an absolute madhouse, and like they all kind of were like driven to the brink of insanity by the pressures of the music business by the end of the decade. And Geffen, I mean, we'll reference him in and out. He definitely deserves. I want to read the couple books that he hates that were written about him. I think one was called The Operator. The other one was called The Rise and Rise of David Geffen. And I mean, he still is one of the most powerful and kind of feared people in Hollywood to this day. And none of it would have been possible without the Eagles. Basically, they were his first come up in a big way. Though he did sign a bunch of artists that, I mean, I have to give it to him to sort like I don't know what he was really up to, but he did seem to have very good taste in music. Like I'll give him that. And he was very savvy about picking artists like Jackson Browne, the Eagles, Joni Mitchell. I believe he signed Neil Young after he like split off from Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and people like that were in this like country rock scene and also Tom Waits, who I was like a huge fan of when I was a teenager.
Yeah, right.
I mean, I guess I still am. But and the Eagles, famously covered Old 55. Exactly, which I kind of, I remember that kind of as a teenager, like, oh, the Eagles covered a Tom Waits song? Wow, okay. And I didn't never really listen to it.
Different like future. Like if you listen to that album, Tom Waits album, that Old 55.
Oh yeah, Closing Time.
Yeah. If you listen to that, you can definitely see the genealogy of like Tom Waits and the Eagles. But like later on, Tom Waits.
It gets where he's like, you wouldn't guess it once he adopts his like doing all that shit. He wanted to exactly interesting artists, but these were all like legit people, and unlike a lot of the 60s bands that had like a mixture of kind of talented singers and songwriters and then just like maybe people with pretty voices that couldn't play guitar and you had to bring in the wrecking crew to like play for them, like David Crosby and stuff like that. All these people were actually like very accomplished musicians and songwriters and singers, and like had the kind of the whole package to like actually, and it did inaugurate this kind of era, this new era of authenticity with the kind of singer-songwriter thing, you know, and which was really dominant in like the first half of the 1970s, and some really like relatively, I think, kind of adult and like introspective and mature music. I think the thing I realized with the Eagles is they get so bagged on, and perhaps rightfully so, in like today's world for being kind of the kind of so emblematic of kind of the more unfortunate tendencies of the boomer generation of like selling out, like being like thinking you're the center of the universe, like having huge egos, but being like kind of sanctimonious and like thinking you're a hero, and just being, I don't know, like cornballs and all this stuff. And, you know, at the same time, I think that like their actual work when they were quite young, like in their 20s, like throughout the 70s, is like remarkably mature, I think, both for their age and compared to like the decades of music following it. Like music got more puerile, and as we talked about, the timbral variety started to plummet like steadily in, you know, the 80s, 90s, and, you know, onto today. And they just like, they were actually seeking, I think they were I think really trying to be like craftsmen and like make the absolute best kind of music out of like the talents and, you know, resources at their disposal. And they did want to take it to the limit, but I think it was kind of in a pure way. And then on top of that, the vibe of their music, which I think has often been, I think even by some of the Eagles themselves, I think Bernie Ledden said this in the documentary, that the reason he thought Take It Easy was such a hit was because there had just been, like, the late 60s had been such a clusterfuck and ended with all these assassinations in Altamont. And then there was the Kent State Massacre, which we'll come back to. And Nixon was bombing Cambodia and all these horrible things were happening. And, like, the young people were just, like, burnt out and, like, dejected and totally fucked. And then this song came on that was just like, hey, like, take it easy. And then people just like went for it. And a lot of people have read that it's like basically the Eagles showed up to tell like the youth of America to go back to sleep and stop worrying about politics and just take it easy. But I think, as with a lot of their songs, I think you could kind of read into it from a few different angles, including that, and I think a lot of their music is like this. There's a kind of like catharsis after a period of like dejecting trauma that I think pervades a lot of their music, maybe particularly the early stuff in the kind of Watergate era, you know, in the late Nixon era, where they are telling you to like cool off and like gather yourself and like find a place to make your stand. And it's also about, you know, finding a cute girl in Winslow, Arizona, pulling up in a flatbed Ford, slowing down to take a look at you. You know,
yeah.
Like it's very simple and like.
Is that like so mature?
Well, I don't think that song. That song's not mature. That song's not mature. I think that what I really refer to with the maturity really comes more. Honestly, I would say probably like mostly. I think Hotel California is the most mature and reflective, and I think it embodies a kind of ambivalent. I don't know. I think that there was kind of a moment in like the mid to late 70s where America was kind of doing a little bit of like a gut check on itself. Like Vietnam had finally just ended in like total disaster and disgrace. You had Nixon out. You had all these commissions of like on assassinations and like MK Ultra and like the CIA doing all this bad shit, and the economy was kind of like faltering and like there was like inflation, and it just seemed like, you know, like where do we go from here, you know? And so I think a song like The Last Resort, which I think you said that you enjoyed,
I think that was like, you know, probably lyrically the best. I mean, Hotel California and Last Resort are both very good. You know, yeah.
You see a certain clarity and a kind of ambivalence towards, they haven't like really swallowed. Even though the 70s was called the me decade, and to many extent, like to a large extent, they were like absolutely living that out to like the max in like pretty crazy ways. But but they also
to me, like is not mature either.
No,
like,
I don't mean that they were mature, but I meant like the type of music that they were trying towards. It was not, and and they all talked about how they were perceived for a while as like too boring, too mild, like they weren't rocking hard enough, like Kiss, because they shared the rise of the charts.
Right.
Like,
I mean,
sure, there was like Fleetwood Mac, but
Kiss, like it's easy
and I will beat
know.
up on Kiss. They're sus.
Yeah,
Knights in Satan's Service, those SS lightning bolts. No. Not that. But like something
sure.
or like Ziggy Stardust, the Starman, or Alice Cooper, like basically Beef and Phantom of the Paradise, like this kind of like really like bleh, like I'm crazy. And it's funny because they were doing all the same drugs and living the same kind of like hardcore lifestyle, but their music was like so smooth and so like calming and stuff most of the time.
There are stars in the southern sky, southward as you go. There is moonlight and moss in the trees, down the seven bridges road.
Okay, now we're jumping through the whole thing, so maybe like let's just rewind to the beginning and explain the little like the bridge from Laurel Canyon to the like who the hell are these guys, and are they sus? We have to do that sus check first, right? Like what kind of thing did they come from? Like, did one of their great grandfathers like found the colony of like New Amsterdam? Did their dad work on LSD experiments at Fort Detrick, etc.? And I think for the most part we can say no. Like for the most part that's not true with any of the original Eagles. The only one is Bernie Ledden, whose dad was a nuclear physicist.
He worked like in the space program too, right? He did like some
I think he
space
did
shit, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so there's a little of that going on, but anyway, so like all of these, most of the original 4 Eagles were Don Henley, Glenn Frey, Bernie Ledden, and Randy Meisner. Now, most of them had met because they were hired to play. They were all in like a few different bands that had like limited success, though Bernie Ledden was in the Flying Burrito Brothers with Graham Parsons, who we talked about, and I believe Bernie Ledden was playing at Altamont, where every other boomer hero just so happened to be that day. Like George Lucas is there with the camera, like Vito Polica's like freaking on a pole, like Tim Leary's there with like the Hells Angels and Mick Jagger, just the Grateful Dead's hanging out, like just the whole gang was there. But then he left. I think he left the Flying Burrito Brothers after Graham Parsons left, after like 2 albums, and he had played in Clark and Dillard with Gene Clark from the Byrds, who apparently was like the main actual talent and creative force behind the Byrds. And then they all ended up kind of playing on the road with Linda Ronstadt, who is also somebody who's like really great, who doesn't get enough props, I think. Linda Ronstadt was, though, I mean, she also, we'll see, she dated Cherry Brown like later. There's a lot of crazy stuff, but basically on that, like Don Henley and Glenn Frey ended up being roommates on the road, and they just started like becoming buddies and playing music together. And I don't think they started actually like writing songs yet, but eventually they got it in their head that like they wanted to form their own band. And I guess Linda Ronstadt and her manager were, by all accounts, very chill and supportive about it, and said, okay, yeah. So they scooped up the bassist from a band called Poco, which is founded by Richie Furay, who was in Buffalo Springfield, another connection. That was Randy Meisner. And they got him together, and then they went after Bernie Ledden, the ex-Flying Burrito brother, who was like a virtuosic mandolin and 5-string banjo and lap steel guitar player. He was like a real country purist.
Yeah, he was the most established. And actually, like, he was kind of the face of the band at first. Like, and he was a little bit older than the rest of them, if I'm not mistaken. Like, he was the most familiar with the industry and stuff,
Yeah, exactly. And he was like kind of their like Swiss Army knife of like country sound. Like, he could really... bring it in like a real way. And though they were all like talented, I mean, Don Henley was the drummer. He was like a good drummer, not the best drummer ever, but like he was good, and he did sing, though he was pretty shy in the beginning and was not the two really on their first album. So, you know, they marched into David Geffen's office at Asylum Records in like 1971 and were like, here we are, take it or leave it, or something like that. That was like how they described it. And David Geffen was like, okay, I'll take it. So they set to work, like they went out to Aspen. I don't know why Aspen is such a big place for all these people to hang out at, but I guess they were in Aspen. They played, you know, they jammed for like a couple months and tried to like figure out their sound. And I think the British producer Glyn Johns came out to see them, and he was like not very impressed. He said they were, quote, confused, and they like didn't know if they were a country band or a rock band.
Actually, you know, one of the lines that I liked a lot about in Last Resort was, you know, I live in New England, so like, you know, the very opening when he's talking about, you know, someone who came from Providence, and like where the old world shadows, you know, hang heavy in the air.
Heavy in the air.
That I like a lot about New England, but I think that I heard a little bit more about the story, and I guess it was a personal story of like some person that he dated or whatever, and I guess she had eventually moved out to Aspen, you know, like at the time when it was sort of like, you know, this sort of free place to like be like out east, you know, like to be with nature. It didn't quite have the connotations that like Aspen has now, and like the song The Last Resort, like, you know, the story of like what kind of happened to Aspen like over the course of the time between then and now, like, is
some part, rich men came and raped the land. So. Nobody caught them.
Yeah.
Put up a bunch of ugly boxes, and Jesus people bought them. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
It was somebody laid the mountains low while the town got high. Oh, so many good double entendres in that song. Don Henley is kind of a master of like the sort of kind of like middlebrow like literary double entendre. Like he's kind of a master of it. But anyways, yeah, like they were kind of, but then when Glyn Johns heard them harmonize in their 4-part harmony, he was like, oh shit, like that is something. So then they kind of decided to like center that as much as possible. And it is kind of like one of the best things about the Eagles, particularly when it was just the 4 of them, their like blend of voices is kind of like amazing. I don't know. I think it's hard to beat. Like it's probably the best since like the Beach Boys. You know, and I think it's still good later on when some people leave, but particularly having Randy Meisner in there, he is the secret weapon with his falsetto. And they, you know, they set out on that first album, and yeah, I think Don Henley only sang one song, "Witchy Woman," which is a great early example of like the Eagles kind of interacting with the susness of Los Angeles a little bit. And coming across some like witchy woman who's like obsessed with crystals and astrology, but might also like hypnotize you or something, and has maybe killed people. Like it's really it's a good vibe. It's a good vibe. And also Randy Meisner's song "Take the Devil," which I kind of love. Like some of the best songs on all their albums are the Randy Meisner ones where he sings lead, and that he wrote, you know, the lyrics for. And like there's always like a real sentimental but like haunted quality to most of his big, you know, his tracks. And yeah, I mean, the first album came out, had like 3 singles, obviously like Take It Easy, you know, just like blue-pilled everybody into like not protesting anymore. So that was a hit. And Peaceful Easy Feeling, and then Witchy Woman, which is like the Bernie Leadon and Don Henley wrote together, and then was Don Henley's like first vocal drumming lead performance. And that was like, oh, cool, like we're a successful band now. Then they moved on, I believe, in like 72. They followed it up pretty quickly with Desperado, which I'm sure everyone's like aware of that song. But I don't know if everybody's like listened to that whole album, because it's like one of their 2 concept albums that, again, I feel like is relatively mature. It has like some very mature themes and like interesting themes going on in it that I don't think it hasn't been dissected nearly as deeply as Hotel California. But I had a kind of weird intuition listening to it a little while ago that, you know, kind of like Hotel California, it's a metaphor about America in 1972 as told through this kind of story that's based on the Doolin Dalton gang, who I guess were a bunch of lawmen out west who became bank robbers and outlaws. And they had gotten all these like old like historical books about the Old West and were like reading them for inspiration for months. And they all became like fixated on this like band of outlaws. And that's like who Desperado is basically referring to in the title track. It's probably their most like heavily like country album. You know, a lot of banjo, a lot of mandolin, slide guitar, and stuff like that. But it's got some really great, I think, Certain Kind of Fool, which Randy Meisner sings, which the entire song is, I think they had an outside writer for that one, but the entire song is a double entendre about him being like a gunfighter outlaw, but also like being a rock star. It's great. It's great. It's just like, I love it. I love it. It's like, you know, he saw the poster on the wall, the picture of a wanted man, like, you know, he kind of liked the feeling so shiny and smooth in his hand. He took it to the country and practiced for days without rest. You know, like it's a guitar, but it's also a gun. Like, you know, it's like a great like great mid-cult songwriting, I think.
It's good mid-cult songwriting.
And I kind of think it's about, I even think the title track, which most people like know, that people know it, I think is, I hear kind of like it's him kind of like interrogating America itself. Like America is the Desperado, and like it's kind of about Vietnam a little bit. Like Vietnam is almost like this, like a spree of like, you know, a bank robbing spree or something, like out on the imperial frontier. But it's like, Desperado, why won't you come to your senses? You've been out riding fences for so long now. You know, you're a hard one, and I know that you got your reasons, but you're gonna end up alone. Like your prison is walking through this world all alone. Like other countries don't want to fuck with you anymore because they're mad about Vietnam.
He saw it in a window, the mark of a new kind of man. He kinda liked the feeling, so shiny and smooth in his hand. He took it to the country and practiced for days without rest. And then one day he felt it. He knew he could stand with the best. They got respect. Oh yeah, he wants the same. Oh yeah, and it's a certain kind of fool that likes to hear the sound of his own
You could definitely read it that way. I mean, you know, obviously there's an author function thanks to, you know, Foucault, the notorious pedo. We can, you know, read different things into the lyrics. But I also feel like this is kind of about, you know, like himself and like how, you know, he's feeling free or whatever, or the freedom of like being a rocker, but it's actually like a prison, you know?
Yes. Which is like the overarching theme of so much in the Eagles is like, I'm free, but I feel like I'm a slave in like a prison that I can't escape.
Yes, definitely true.
Which is maybe maybe the most like resonant theme in all the Eagles catalog is like, we're actually in like a slave complex.
Yes, I mean, definitely, you know, true to an extent. They were victims in a way of a system, but it's a little bit ironic because it's borderline one of those things that makes you want to say, like, get over it, you know, like, it's, yeah, but,
all this pigeon,
you know,
why don't you pigeon a fit, get over it. Probably the cringiest song ever.
Get over it.
That they did. Get over it, Bernie and Randy. Get over it, Don Felder.
But,
it made me reflect on how, like, the dynamics of the music industry almost make me, especially after reading Don Felder's autobiography, which we'll get to in a little bit, which is kind of a definitely an alternative history of a lot of the things that happen, that it almost feels like everybody in the music industry is either like an abuser or a victim, and like you have to be like either one or the other or like a mixture of both, but like I'm sure that's not like literally true, but it feels like it pushes you towards one or the other of those dynamics where like you're either going to get totally taken advantage of and like exploited and then maybe like literally destroyed by it, or you're going to like side with like the masters and then you're going to become like, and I feel like Don and Glenn ultimately ended up like siding with the masters. And the thought, it's better to be a master than a slave. And then everyone else in the Eagles is in some form of like music industry slavery, or you know.
It's I mean, it's a cutthroat world, and I really do empathize with, you know, this is my first experience encountering a lot of this material and these histories and mythoi, you know, but I definitely did empathize with like the Eagles who were forced out, you know. I think, you know, I understand like Bernie's position, you know, like I think that, you know, he seemed to have some remorse about pouring that bottle of Budweiser or whatever. I love how they were also, another amazing boomer thing about them is that they love Budweiser, and they're like, we have a bad
long neck Bud
Budweiser. Yeah, like cool. You know, obviously he had some remorse about it, but, you know, I understand like why because, you know, like we talked about, he kind of was like in the band from the beginning. He almost had sort of like a very front and center role. It was one kind of thing, and like these two guys like just went insane. Like they went fucking nuts. They got like crazy for like becoming rockers, which is like just a bizarre like thing
obsession.
To find oneself obsessed with. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like it's almost like they were possessed by like this idea of being rockers.
It almost is.
You know.
It feels there are shaitanic influences like lurking in the wings, and I think, you know, looking at it like today, it's like, like why couldn't you just stay like this cool country rock band that you were? Like, why? I mean, it's cool, you want to like, you know, go, but like the fear and the insecurity only increased as they got more successful, and they developed these ideas that we have to become like a rock band. Like the fact that people don't take us seriously as a rock band is like unacceptable, and like we need to like show them. Yeah,
like, well, but I don't, like, you know, if you're really like making music, like, do you really care that much about like what genre like you are or whatever, you know? I don't know.
And to be fair,
Taylor
Bernie
obviously had her own foibles where she's like, I gotta be pop, you know, I'm making my pop album, etc. Of
course.
You know, I noticed that with her before I even, you know, knew much about the Eagles, where it's like, why do you have this obsession with like being like, who the fuck cares like about being pop, like, versus country?
Exactly.
You know, the analogies, you know, just proliferate. But
well, you know, I think there is.
You know,
I mean, it can get problematic to talk about, but there is a kind of like, I don't know if you call it like a cosmopolitan or like a coastal bias towards the country music industry and genre in general. And there's always been this kind of ambivalent relationship of like, there's some really great kind of musicianship and sounds and songs that come out of country, but like it's like, you know, never go full country, because like that's just,
I mean, what's the like, there's that like sort of cliche phrase that like, you know, you either actually unironically hear or you hear people throw out as like, you know, an archetypally like obnoxious opinion, which is like, I like everything except for rap and country, you know, and so like you can
there's kind of a horseshoe theory going on where like
side by side,
well, like hardcore rap and hardcore country are too too othery. They're too othery.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Exactly. They're for they're for the proles. They're for, you know, the you know, the
they're not high art. They're not high art.
Yeah, exactly.
You know,
and I mean, like pop country is like incredibly, but again, like these are just kind of subcategories of like mainstream music, where like they're just like kind of their own top 40 universe. You know, pop country is like awful and shitty, but like a lot of you know, as we've talked about in many episodes, a lot of like mainstream hip hop is also fucking awful.
Well, both have been like there's been popified versions of both like rap and hip hop and country now that kind of have their own presence and in a way kind of
pop,
dominance
like,
over those genres.
Like, I don't know, like, you know, I guess pop is just like whatever, why don't you just meet me in the middle is, although she was originally a country person too, the person who sang that song, I guess, was like a sort of crunchy crossover person, but they do,
you know, they do value like good singing in country still in a kind of a more classical sort of sense, so it's a good farm system for plucking out people that have good singing voices, and then you can
the sort of
Dr. Lucify them.
there's the heritage of like folk music, you know, country and folk. They kind of like go hand in hand to an extent. Like, folk
which
is
are
a little
really,
bit
I mean,
different thing, but yeah,
it's a little bit different. But if you want to think about it, like I'd say because if you boil all this music down and kind of go back to like the early 20th century, there's really like kind of a few genres of American music that ended up sort of shaping the entire landscape of like American music, and most of them came from African American like populations and traditions, basically. So you had basically jazz, you had rhythm and blues, and then you also had folk, and you had country, which did have more like, I mean, country was a kind of very like white kind of, you know, version of music, but still very rural. And folk, of course, like had kind of came from all over the place, but also had a kind of rural and
and I mean, like,
you kind of straddle the line sometimes between blues.
Like there's a lot of influence, like moving across.
And then of
like,
course rock and roll, which like synthesized like rhythm and blues and blues and rhythm and blues and stuff like that. And then, you know, the kind of genius synthesis, whoever initially came up with it in the 60s, of basically combining like sort of folk, like, you know, like acoustic based folk, often with a kind of, you know, social political message, like Woody Guthrie type stuff that Bob Dylan and Joan Baez were kind of riffing on, and then combine that with like the electrified rock and roll sound that had been developed by black musicians who were like kind of upgrading our rhythm and blues into something a little more peppy and upbeat. And I mean, you already saw with Elvis how they managed to like kind of mainstream that sound and break it into the mainstream with this like handsome, you know, hip gyrating like white artist and stuff. But I mean, all the Eagles were pretty much grew up in parts of the country where they were exposed to black music, and they all give that a lot of credit for basically like sparking their interest. And I mean, what's more boomery than this? But like all of them say it, that like seeing the Beatles on TV in like 1964 was like a bolt of lightning.
Just changed my life.
What the were they like putting like weird subliminal messages in like the Ed Sullivan Show performances? Like how did everybody get so just like blown away by the Beatles? And like it still kind of boggles my mind. Like, you know what I mean? Like, okay, they're good, but like, you know, Glenn Frey had a hilarious story of like I think he like begged his parents to like let him go see the Beatles when they came to Detroit, where he grew up when he's a teenager. And during the Beatles performance, like an older teenage girl just like fainted and like fell back into his arms.
Yeah, like screaming about Paul.
Like Paul. Exactly. And that was the moment where he, in true Glenn Frey fashion, was like, hey, like this seems like a cool gig, you know, like put on his sunglasses and hopped in a red Corvette and like sped off, you know. But basically it's like for him it was like he realized that like that was the way to be cool and like get girls and stuff. And like you know, Don Felder said something kind of similar, but for him it was also like rising out of like extreme poverty, and basically it was like the only thing available to him. But you know, Don Henley also grew up in Texas, kind of rural Texas, and was able to catch the signals from a black radio station in New Orleans. So he got really like blues pilled at a very young age. You know, they all loved like B.B. King, and Glenn Frey was like obsessed with Motown growing up, obviously. And he also had like a weird, all these guys like met somebody that ended up being really big, which is like kind of bizarre. Like Glenn Frey managed to meet Bob Seger in Detroit when he was like 18, and like convinced Bob Seger to like let him play like session guitar and stuff like that. And I think helped him like when he moved out to LA to like introduce him to a few people. Don Henley did the same thing with Kenny Rogers in Dallas, and like spammed him to be like, Kenny Rogers, like please come see my band. And Kenny Rogers was like, I normally don't do that, but I figure this young kid seems pretty he's pretty eager, so why not? And then he like signed their first band, Shiloh, to his record label, so that worked. It's just like boomers just like stumble into like just amazing things happening to them. Like it's just like so wow, like how nice. And Don Felder, who had joined the group later, he grew up in Gainesville, I think where the University of Florida is. And when he was playing in a teenage band called the Continentals, he met this young kid, this military brat with like a crew cut, who had a really good singing voice. And I guess he had moved to Florida because his like military dad had moved there. And then one day he like disappeared after playing with him for a while. He disappeared one day, and there were like rumors that like he moved to Central America. because his family was like moving to do military stuff down there. That guy's name was Stephen Stills. And so, like, okay, like Buffalo Springfield, like Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. And so, yeah, they all like bumped into people like that. And Don Felder also became friends with Bernie Leadon because I guess his dad moved to the University of Florida to work on nuclear research or something when he was a teenager. And they like played together for a little while. And so they knew each other going way back. So I guess it was like, if you're into music back then, I don't know. Like, it was easy to just bump. Also, Don Felder gave guitar lessons to like a 12-year-old Tom Petty. Like, it's just like, what? You know, it's like I didn't know Gainesville, Florida was like this hotbed of like, and I guess when you add like Graham Parsons to it, Florida kind of even I hate to say it, but you know, maybe Florida doesn't get enough love or enough credit for producing you know, all these like boomering musicians and stuff. But anyways, so they created Desperado, which like I recommend people listen to. I think even if it's not about Vietnam, I think it is about kind of both where they're at and where like America is at. Like the reprise, the Doolin Dalton Desperado mashup reprise at the end, highly underrated. You know, the Queen of Diamonds let you down. She was just an empty fable. The Queen of Hearts, it's always your best bet. It's just like warning America to like stop being so imperialist and fascist. And anyways, so that album, which I think is like pretty, it upheld, you know, it stood up to the test of time, but it actually wasn't that popular and it didn't sell very well. And so the pressure they got was like,
because it was like a cowboy
Eagles
record, and it's like, no, like, and they got psyoped by.
They got earned for being too country.
The Queen of Diamonds let you down. She was just an empty fable. The Queen of Hearts, you say you never met. Your twisted fate has found you out, and it's finally turned the table. Stole your dreams and paid you with regret. Desperado. Is there gonna be anything left? Is there gonna be? You sealed your fate up a long time. Ain't it hard when you're all alone in the center ring? Now there's no time left to borrow. Is there gonna be anything left? Only stardust. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe tomorrow.
So yeah, they got kind of psyoped, or I don't know, got a cold shoulder, got a little bit of an from the music press for releasing Desperado until Linda Ronstadt did a cover of it, and then it made it a little more popular. But this is where the dialectic within the Eagles started to like heat up and intensify between, are they a country band or are they a rock band? And it's like, even though they always were a little bit of both, I guess they felt like they really needed to be more rock, or else they risked fucking their careers up if their third album didn't do well. You know, they get written off as just like some lame like country band. And so while they were recording their third album, On the Border, they decided they needed a pinch hitter to beef up the guitar action in their band. And so as a result of that, they went back to Bernie Leadon's high school buddy from Gainesville, Florida, the inimitable Don Fingers Felder. That was his nickname, Fingers Felder, and I think for good reason, because he's probably he's one of like the the nastiest guitar players, I think, from that era. And I feel like he's really been done dirty, probably arguably more than anybody, maybe Randy more. But I feel like in terms of getting like totally screwed over and like disrespected and like emotionally abused by the Eagles, I feel, really bad. But, they brought him, he was working as a session musician. Bernie had convinced him to like finally come out to LA. He was living in Boston, actually. I think he was teaching lessons at the Berklee College of Music for a while. Yeah. So he was like a very accomplished like guitarist who, grew up like very dirt poor and had just scrapped his way like into being a session musician. And they brought him in and he jammed with them, and he started adding some of those signature licks that are like so key to all the Eagles songs of like the second half of like the 70s. And they released that, and it did pretty well. It's actually a good album. It's like a good. I don't think they ever had like a bad album except for maybe The Long Run, but we'll get to that. But it's got some good. It's got like My Man, which is like Bernie Leadon's like tribute to Graham Parsons, who had just died, and it has like some other. I think it had The Best of My Love, which is their first #1 single, which is kind of a corny ballad, but like a good corny ballad. And so then that kind of put them on like, it's also when they enlisted the services. They dropped their British producer who was like sick of them, and
and he was like, you're not the Who is a rock band, you're not the
rock
Who
band.
Or whatever.
There was a funny anecdote where, because he had recorded Led Zeppelin, and Don Henley kept asking him to like make his drums sound more like John Bonham's, and he's like, well then fucking hit it harder. It's like play more like him if you want it to sound like him, dummy. So like he kind of exacerbated some of their insecurities, and so they needed a new producer, and they found this guy who had found his way into the record industry after being a sonar operator in the U.S. Navy hunting for Soviet submarines. So, a little bit of a slight sus connection there, but really more just a sign of like the times of like that's a thing that would definitely happen. And I'm talking about the Soul Pole himself, Bill Szymczyk, the like large Polish bear of a man who ended up becoming like one of the preeminent mixers and producers and engineers of like the era. And he was brought in because he had recently done some records for the solo artist Joe Walsh, and they liked the kind of really like punchy sound and the sonic perfection that he was able to achieve in all those recordings. Right. So they brought him in, and like, so their sound got a little more, I think it does sonically, it sounds kind of better mixed for them, I think, on the third album. But then it was like, okay, you've done this, now you got 5 people, you have 3 guitarists, and you got to start, well, first I think they went on tour, but then this is where it's worth mentioning how Don Felder describes it in his autobiography real quick, how it felt joining the Eagles, because on the one hand, he had a wife, Susan, who I think he had just found out was pregnant, and he had just moved out to LA. He was like freaked out that like they weren't going to be able to support themselves, and that he was just like a burnout hippie rocker that was going to be poor, and like his dad was right, that like his dad like maniacally would always tell him like, why don't you cut your hair, like,
right,
like every time he saw him.
I remember
it was like
that,
really sad. Just like, why don't you cut your hair and be respectable? And he had worked in like a car plant his entire life, and like that was like ruined his body, like breathing in like industrial fumes all day, and like it was just like a broken man. That was, so he was so jazzed that he got to be in this band now, and like Glenn Frey like called him up personally and told him, man, like we're all gonna be like equal, like because we had all been sidemen in bands before. When we started the Eagles, we decided like we're all splitting it like 4 ways, and now like I think they did a thing where it's like, you're not going to get profits on the songs on this album we wrote before you join, but like you'll have equal share on all the ones you did play on, and going forward you're going to have, it's going to be split 5 even ways through Eagles Ltd, and that's all it is. And he just thought like, dream come true, amazing. But then when he went to actually show up for the first day and like really join them and play with them, he immediately sensed like, oh, like how fucked the vibes were. that there was like a lot of tension simmering just below the surface, and that particularly he was bummed out that like Bernie Ledden, his old friend, who, you know, had kind of introduced him to all the Eagles, was like really not having a great time. And on top of that, his new presence in the band as like a rock guitarist was seen as like edging out Bernie's influence as a country, you know, mandolin banjo player, that the band was, you know, going in this like less country direction. Bernie was becoming more replaceable, and so like that was a weird thing for Don Felder to confront. And then just like the ultra kind of touchiness of like Don and Glenn, which at that point was starting to creep up, and at this point they were starting to write songs together regularly. And you know, of course, they're hailed today as, I think in a lot of cases rightfully so, for being like a great songwriting duo and everything. But I guess that took a pretty heavy cost, and there was like a lot of just like really sensitive emotions when they were in the studio playing together. Like any one little thing could just like piss off Glenn or like piss off Don. And, you know, like Randy was like walking on eggshells like in the background with his bass because apparently he wasn't an alpha, according to Joe Walsh.
Right.
And, you know, like it was just this like toxic kind of alpha atmosphere, and they were all like hyper like obsessed on the next album because it's always like they just constantly felt this pressure. And I think it was like around this is what, 73, so it's a little before, well, we'll talk about that in a second, but like the pressure from like Geffen and Irving Azoff, who worked for Geffen, to like go on tour, release an album, record an album, go on tour, record an album, like literally like every year, just like keep going. And what was already going on, I think, by the time that Felder joined was the way that you kept going in that kind of paradigm was lots and lots of cocaine.
Yeah.
The departure of Bernie Ledden and then Hotel California, I want to pause here because on the business side of the whole Eagles experience, this period of time is kind of interesting, and I'll try not to get too down the rabbit hole, but it has some tentacles that spread very far and wide and might even explain a little bit of the more satanic, or I don't know, maybe Barbrook would say like Stalinist communist turn in the Eagles with Don and Glenn in the later 70s as they succumbed to doing an authoritarianism and all that stuff. So
they definitely did no growth. But it did not lead to like a cyber communist rock utopia, apparently. It didn't.
But
no.
I'm just going to reference a little here from, I think, Don Felder's very interesting autobiography, Heaven and Hell, My Life in the Eagles, which I think, came out in 2008. But in the one chapter here, chapter 8, he writes, now this is a little before he joined the Eagles, so we're jumping back a little bit, but he writes,
I mean, David the title Geffen, of the book is just like super telling. Like, I just feel like if you would describe, anyway, but...
he was thinking to himself, this could be heaven or this could be hell. And it turned out that there were parts of it that were heavenly, but ultimately he was going to hell in a bucket.
Yes.
Yeah, it was not good.
Yeah, despite not being in the Grateful Dead, he found himself nevertheless in hell in a bucket.
I guess they go to hell in a bucket. In the Eagles, you're just trapped in Hotel California forever, and you can't escape, but you can only check out. So he writes, David Geffen seemed to be the common denominator with many of the new West Coast bands having the most success. Aggressively ambitious, having worked his way up from the mailroom at the William Morris Agency, Geffen was reaching for the stars, and whoever was hanging on to his coattails was undoubtedly in for a ride. Bernie knew Geffen was the key, so he took me along to his cramped second-floor offices in a building at the Beverly Hills end of Sunset Boulevard one day and plugged me as the hot new guitar player. He says, David was not that much older than I, but he was like a light bulb, radiant with energy, ideas, and excitement. Along with his partner, Elliot Roberts, he was a dynamic driving force, creating avenues for the artists who would come to define the Southern California music scene. There was a tremendous buzz around him and his company with its laid-back approach and talented young stars. David's office was a hotbed of creativity. He shrewdly took a unique combination of talented artists and combined them with great management skills. I don't think either one would have survived without the other element. Each one compelled them to international level. Whatever he was doing, it was working, and with the Eagles, he seemed to be trying to create the quintessential American band. It seemed that everything Geffen touched turned to gold, although I'm sure he crushed a few golden toes along the way. And he also writes that, no one wore a suit and a tie. Most of his employees were in jeans with long hair, giving his office an atmosphere that was casual, yet up to the minute. The hierarchy was clear. Elliot Roberts was in charge of the company's two biggest acts, Joni Mitchell and Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, whom he'd personally managed from the start. Geffen ran the day-to-day side of the company and handled a few key players of his own. The man in charge of the new Eagles account, along with clients Dan Fogelberg and wild rocker Joe Walsh, was the management company's number 3, a brash, diminutive 20-something firecracker named Irving Azoff, who joined Geffen's office the previous year. And so that was how they came in with like Irving Azoff, who eventually would become their manager. So after they released their third album, On the Border, Geffen actually... he kind of makes a sudden decision without really telling the Eagles or anybody else to sell Asylum Records to Warner Communications. Now, everybody knows what Warner Brothers is, right? I mean,
yes.
Warner Brothers, it's a film studio and it's also a music label.
The Animaniacs live inside of it, you know.
Yep, the Animaniacs do live inside of it. And so Asylum basically... Yes, in 1975, I guess he sold... Okay, this gets into some real Mark Lombardi, like, interlock territory. So bear with me if I get some of the exact years wrong. But around in the early 70s, I believe that Warner Brothers had acquired Atlantic Records, which, as we mentioned in the Dave McGowan episode, was run by a son of a young Turk, Ahmet Erdogan, who grew up on Embassy Row, and Frank Zappa named one of his children after him, and really pioneered this idea of like young, good-looking, like white bands playing basically black music mixed with folk and psychedelic stuff and all that thing. He was a big deal, but then he got absorbed by Warner Brothers. And then something strange happened in the early I believe it was maybe in 1969. The entire Warner Brothers kind of empire, which was having some financial difficulties, was bought by a company called the Kinney Parking Company, which was a New Jersey parking lot company owned by Manny Kimmel, Sigmund Dornbusch, and mob figure Abner Zwillman. Now, who is Abner Zwillman? He was an American mob boss who rose to power in the criminal underworld in North Jersey. He was a longtime friend and associate of mobsters Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, with whom he sat on the commission. Zwillman's criminal organization was part of the National Crime Syndicate and mainly operated from the 1920s to the 1950s, with its peak in the late 1930s. Now, he and these other guys started this basically like mob front company, the Kinney Parking Company, and it's hard to like imagine today like such a thing just happening and like nobody batting an eye, but I guess they just bought all of Warner Brothers in like 1969. Yes, they, after buying the Ashley Famous talent agency a little bit before that, and the whole thing was led by the guy who had risen up to the top of the company, a guy named Steve Ross. And Steve Ross ended up being the CEO of this new company that was called Warner Communications, which was Warner Brothers movie studio and Warner Music Group, which I guess like basically owned the Eagles and all the Asylum artists at the end of the day. The music industry always makes my head spin with all of these labels and sub-labels and distributors. Like, you always hear about like specific labels being, but they're always attached to like a big studio.
Yeah, they're all ultimately the fucking same. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're all basically the same. So you can see this, that it's like the same group of people, like through a variety of shifting companies, basically are controlling everything the entire time. But these companies are just constantly morphing. And I think we talked about, God, maybe even in the first episode, about how people connected to Bill Casey and the company Capital Cities staged a kind of like hostile takeover of ABC in the mid 80s, and then that merged with Disney, and you know, yada yada. That's the Disney we have today. And a similar thing seems to have kind of happened here, because they took over Warner Brothers and I think also Seven Art Studios in 1969. Then in 1972, the National Kinney Corporation got basically caught up in a national financial like price fixing scandal with their parking lots. Like there was a huge kind of like money laundering like financial scandal that basically got them into trouble with the law a little bit. So what they did is they spun off National Kinney Corporation spun off all of their parking and other assets that weren't related to entertainment, and then they just renamed themselves Warner Communications. So it's like some kind of like corporate invasion of the body snatcher shit, where they like went in and like just like they pulled off the skin of like Warner Brothers and like put it on like a mask or something. They're like wearing Warner Brothers like face as like a mask, and now they're just considered Warner Brothers. And so they then controlled basically Atlantic Records and Asylum Records and Elektra. They merged Elektra and Asylum together. And then in like 1975, David Geffen basically kind of sells his share in Asylum and leaves running it to go become a vice president of the Warner Brothers film division. So he's like still working for the same people, but now he's jumping over to the film industry. And I guess I think he took some of the royalty stuff like with him when he quit in a way that was incredibly shady. And basically the Eagles, along with now I guess the new head of that label, Irving Azoff, who then became like their full-time manager, sued David Geffen for like breach of contract. And then it wouldn't be the first, or it wouldn't be the last time that basically they would get involved in lawsuits with David Geffen. They have a very, especially Don Henley has like a very like tolerate hate relationship with Geffen. But basically then Irving Azoff became like their guy. And I mean, we'll pop up later, but Don Henley has said repeatedly, he has like a line about Irving Azoff that he's Satan, but he's our Satan. And I think it's probably an apt description, judging by, I don't know, the kind of his management style, and also like a sus thing for Don Henley to say, like, dude, chill out, like why are you so excited about having your own little Satan to like well, anyways, so okay, so so that is like a weird thing that I think jumps out and I think warrants further investigation down the line. Like, was like a huge chunk of the movie industry in like the early 70s just kind of like straight up bought out by the Mafia? Like a Mafia connected front company connected to Meyer Lansky. Also interesting, just like total tangential thing, but one of the most powerful producers or production companies that's attached to a studio in Hollywood over the last 10 years has been Rat Pack, which of course it featured at one time Steve Mnuchin worked for it. Even produced things like financed things like Inherent Vice, but the main mover in it was ultra douchebag director-producer Brett Ratner, who I personally discovered digging into him a couple years ago when he like almost got Me Too'd like 20 times, but is still working, that his childhood mentor was this kindly old man who used to sit on like South Beach, Miami, and I guess he was like a lonely kid, and this old man just took him under his wing and was really cool, and you know, all that stuff. It was almost like a father figure to him. And then he died and found out that guy was Meyer Lansky. So, so he's the biggest, like, he's the guy who goes out and raises money for all of these big productions that happen ultimately in Warner Brothers. And as we'll see, the company that was Warner Brothers, it eventually would merge with Time in 1989 and become Time Warner. Then it would become AOL Time Warner. Now it's like Warner Media. Like, they're still around, but it's still the same core company. It's just like merged with 10 other things since then. And that, of course, covers, even back in the 70s, like the kind of the list of things that it controlled is really like, it's kind of like everything. So, you know, you had like Warner Brothers Movies, Warner Brothers Television. They were a big pioneer in like cable TV. The Warner Brothers Music Group, Dimension Pictures, and DC Comics and Mad Magazine. Then eventually, one of their initiatives in the early 80s was a partnership, or in 79 was a partnership with American Express that became Warner Amex Satellite Entertainment, which actually was the first to launch cable channels such as MTV, Nickelodeon, the Movie Channel, and VH1. And then eventually that was sold, those channels were sold off to Viacom in the 80s, and then it was renamed MTV Networks. And that's like even the entire MTV thing was created by the same company.
Helped the Eagles a lot down the line, right? Like, you know, to get back on their feet, you know, at a certain point, you know, having they did a big unplugged special and all that stuff in I think 1994, and they really went all out trying to push them, and they were pretty kind to both Glenn Frey and Don Henley in the 80s. They both had a couple, you know, Smuggler's Blues, one of Subliminal Child's favorite music videos. Yes, right.
And really staggering work. But also Don Henley's Boys of Summer and a few other hits. You know, he was out there, and he was doing a lot of duets. I was re-listening to that
song today. Interesting.
Deadhead Sticker on a Cadillac. Very interesting. But you know, they were basically, they were helped throughout the 80s by MTV, even though Don Henley like hated kind of like being in music videos and like hamming it up that way. They felt uncomfortable, like, you know, but Glenn Frey like loved it. And like really ate it up. But you know, none of the other Eagles, some of whom, especially Randy Meisner, like put out a couple of great records in the early 80s, didn't really get the same amount of love from the music industry or the critics or MTV or anything like that. So you know, makes you wonder. But anyways, like, I mean, you could even go I don't want to go too far, but basically I just real quick, I'll just mention Steve Ross, who like was the CEO of like Warner Communications and like was originally from Kinney, this mobbed up like parking company in New Jersey. He eventually, you know, did this thing with Time, where he merged in 1989, and of course Time had been, you know, was the ultimate blue blood corporation that was run by Henry Luce of Skull and Bones, who was friends with, you know, George Bush and all that. But critical to that huge merger, which is like still with us today, was a prominent lawyer that we've discussed before named Arthur Liman, who you might remember was the kind of hero Mueller of the Iran-Contra hearings in the 80s, but basically like failed to actually get anybody like actually punished for what they did. And of course, whose son was the director Doug Liman, who made American Made, the kind of Hollywood version of the Barry Seal movie starring Tom Cruise a few years ago. And you know, of course, I found a great article from Daniel Hopsicker, who is as the kind of resident expert of Barry Seal, really hated that movie. But you know, he dug a little bit into Arthur Liman because he's remembered as this like public interest lawyer and like legal scholar and, you know, a good liberal and blah blah blah. Well, he looked into it. It turns out that like his Steve Ross's main lawyer at this mobbed up Warner company was Arthur Liman, and actually Arthur Liman was like instrumental in all kinds of business dealings they did throughout the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, but was particularly instrumental in convincing those old wasps over at Time to like team up with this like mafia company. And so that a lot of that was going on at the same time that he was basically running around like pretending to get to the truth behind Oliver North or anything like that. So that's really interesting that like, wow, okay, small world, like all these guys, you know, and people all kind of said like, oh yeah, Arthur Liman did so many like borderline or not even borderline illegal things in terms of like advancing Steve Ross's interests and like Warner's interests in the corporate world. So maybe if we wonder like where did the mafia go like after the 80s, I don't know, maybe this is where some of them went, was right into corporate America. They just bought their way into the real game.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But anyways, that's all just like an extensive tentacular tangent from basically our main timeline here. But like keep all that in mind, because like the business environment when Azoff takes over and Geffen kind of goes away, and then like their fame is like kind of steadily rising, it really starts to like shift around that time. And I guess it has like very stressful, catastrophic consequences for the band eventually.
One of these nights, one of these crazy old nights, we're gonna find out, pretty mama, that turns on your lights. The full moon is calling, the fever is high, and the wicked wind whispers and moans. You got your demons, and you got desires, but I got a few of my own. Ooh, someone to be kind to in between the dark and the light. Ooh, coming right behind you, swear I'm gonna find you one of these dreams, one of these lost and lonely dreams. We're gonna find one, one that really screams. I've been searching for the daughter of the devil himself. I've been searching for an angel in white. I've been waiting for a woman who's a little of both, and I can feel it, but she's nowhere inside. Loneliness will blind you in between the wrong and the right. Coming right behind you, swear I'm gonna find you one of these nights.
They do one more album after that, which is like big, which is One of These Nights, and it's the first one that like Don Felder's on for the whole thing, and it's like the last one that Bernie Ledman is on, because he kind of starts to reach his breaking point. And I don't know, like we read a little bit about that in Felder's book, but I don't know, it sounded like you were a little impressed with Bernie's approach to the rock and roll lifestyle as opposed to
yes, I was. Like I said, I definitely understand his attitude, and it makes sense, the quote in my own reading stood out to me, and you took a note on it as well, where he, met up with him years later, and, he was like, how you doing, man? And he was like, great. And he was like, and it's like I saw in his eyes like that he was like telling the truth, like he really was like doing well, it wasn't just like when you tell someone you're doing great like just so that
you don't bring them down,
impressive to them or whatever, they don't worry about you. But he said like that suddenly he had like some kind of like flash of envy of him, and realized that like he escaped
the Hotel California.
Exactly, like he took his own path, and like after all that, you'd think like being kicked out basically, I mean he did kind of choose to leave, but it would seem to be like a bad turn of events to like have to leave the Eagles, you know. But I'm trying to find his actual. Yeah, he says, looking across at him, I was suddenly filled with envy. Bernie had escaped the treadmill the Eagles had become. He had stood up for what he believed in and walked away from all the crap to do what he wanted. With Run C&W, he'd injected some of his unique humor into the country music scene and was clearly never going to take the industry too seriously again. If there was one thing I'd learned from Bernie, and there was so much, I mean, he really did, like, you know, pretty much put this guy in with the Eagles to begin with. You know,
he did.
so it's kind of awkward that, like, Don Felder stayed on after putting that. But it was that his kind of music originates in a very selfless place. There are no egos in bluegrass, what come from Sunday revivals down by the river, and a shared sense of fun and community spirit. I mean, I don't know if there's no egos in bluegrass, but, like, you know, the overall sentiment, like...
would you call that, would you call that, like, that's pretty hawk?
Yeah, exactly. He was the most on-hawk, like, member of the Eagles, I think, you know. And he even said, like, salam alaikum to them in leaving, you know. He said, I wish you peace.
Oh, he did say that,
song,
yeah, with a song, you know, that on this album, because we are there, yeah, a song co-written with Ronald Reagan's daughter, Patty Davis.
Yeah,
which is
right.
another kind of hilarious dynamic that was introduced that did contribute to Bernie leaving. He got into a really tight relationship with the California governor, because he still was, I think, at this time, up to 74, with Patty Davis, with basically Ronald Reagan's like hippie daughter, who lived with him in Topanga Canyon. With all the other kind of
like Nancy
hippies.
Reagan like disowned her because she was like living with him and like he outside of marriage, you know, and like he wore jeans, you know, and like he looked like he did look like a stereotypical hippie scum kind of you know, kind of guy. Yeah, he was also like the first one to like stop doing drugs kind of like so aggressively, you know, and got into, you know, apparently according to Don Felder, he had a nickname of like Marty Martian, and like eventually it came to signify that like his eyes were like so clear and bright like compared to everyone else in the Eagles, you know, like watching, like reading Don Felder's book and also like watching the documentary, especially when you see like what happened to Joe Walsh, like who we'll get into, like you know, I was remembering like during the recent Q&A when they're like, what's your hottest take that like gets the most pushback, and like we said a couple of things, but something that like I was kicking myself because what really I think like slipped my mind is like, just don't do drugs. Like, you know, like just don't, like, it's not like they're not good, like, you know, I mean what the Quran says is true, like, you know, they have obviously some benefits, but like they're greatly outweighed by like their harms, like you know, so that idea I think is probably the idea that I have that is like the one that would be most pushed back against. But I think that the story of the Eagles definitely testifies to the validity of that sentiment, you know.
Oh, like, for sure. They were the vanguards of a few things, but they were definitely, I think, the vanguard of like what happens if you just never stop doing cocaine and just do more and more of it and just keep going. Because it was in that weird point in time. The thing with cocaine is very odd, and there's a few odd aspects of it that I feel like they demand some kind of further explanation, because I've read this in other books before, but I thought they must be getting the numbers wrong. But then they mentioned it in Felder's book. He mentioned his first time coming into contact with cocaine, and I just wanted to like put it into context. Like Don said that drugs were a frequent feature for everyone on the road, and for the first time I came into contact with cocaine, it wasn't something I indulged in often because I couldn't afford it. $100 for a gram of blow is way out of my league. Moreover, when your body isn't used to it, a little bit of that stuff goes a long way. And so I just like pulled up an inflation calculator, because I read this in another book about like the 70s rock scene, and they mentioned something about like how expensive a gram of cocaine was in the 70s. And I put it in like, what was $100 in 1972 when he was referring to it? That was like about $650 for a gram of cocaine. And I don't know, maybe people don't know like kind of, you know, what's the going rate for like a gram of cocaine in 2021, but as far as I know, it's under $100. Like $100 would be like expensive, I think, for like a gram of cocaine. So the fact that in the 70s all these people just had like unlimited access to cocaine, but it was like almost $700 a gram, like how could anybody afford like that level of addiction unless you were like a billionaire like that? So it makes me wonder if how much of it were they getting for free, were they getting it from their record label, or Irving Azoff. You know, all those people have fixers and drug
well,
supply
they were
stuff.
saying that like they arranged to have it at one point. They were arranging to have it like on top of their amps, like just have lines like lined up on top of their amps, so that like they could go over during their concerts and be like, I'm adjusting my knobs, and just like snort a line of coke. Like, you know. And you really see kind of how like the dynamic we talked about, the California ideology of like I don't know, if the rebellious spirit of the 60s promised that like work would become play, in the Eagles, like doing cocaine went from being like play to being like play becoming work, because they really started using it more heavily to cope with the chronic fatigue of like both being on the road constantly and like doing shows every night and being shuttled around, and really it didn't sound like particularly luxurious conditions. Like they, you know, Irving Azoff like scheduled them so tightly they would just get like packed into a van or like a plane and just like shipped off to the next hotel and the next venue, and then like immediately shipped off to the next one. And on top of that, like having to go back in the studio and be inspired. That's what I think Glenn Frey said, is he started like dabbling in cocaine because it would get him going on like an idea for songwriting stuff. But then they all started doing it. Yeah, and Don Felder said something like, you know, I'm sure that it affected, like, it really, you know, I know it's not the same, like, but it really reminded me, like, a lot of weed, like, experiences that I've had, like, in my own life with weed, you know, like, where it starts out, like, even what Don Felder said, where, like, a little bit goes a long way. Like, at first, you just need a little bit of weed, and it's like this, you know, you feel like you're having the best ideas in the world, like, regardless of whether you are, you know, like, like, a lot of the effect is, like, whether there's like a creativity aid to it or not, like, you know, you have this sort of euphoric feeling. But then, you know, I forget who, maybe it was what Glenn Frey said in the documentary, but, you know, he was saying like eventually it just becomes like a dependency, basically. Like, in order to work, in order to have ideas at all, like, you need this all of a sudden. And like, obviously cocaine, like, you know, thankfully I've never been a cocaine addict, like, alhamdulillah, but like, you know, the parallels, like, are very much, like, there. I mean, the weed that the Eagles were smoking, like, you know, probably was
so
different
weak
from, like, the fucking synthesized, like, you know, government weed that, like, we're getting, like, you know, today.
No, I think Don Felder also said something insane about how, like, in the late 60s or early 70s, you could buy like a half ounce of weed for like $5 or something. Like, that was like a dime bag was like a quarter ounce of weed or something. It was like, what? Like, so it must have been really weak, and they were just smoking like really big joints or something. And you know, maybe we should go back. I want, like, you know, I think the market should cater to that, but probably not, because they want people to be psyoped by like 36% THC weed now, but like where's the light option where it's like, hey, can I buy some like 70s weed that's just like mellow and doesn't completely, like,
I mean, I guess
spin
that's
my
like
brain
CBD
around?
Kind of, like, maybe that's like what that is, but I don't know, like,
anyways,
like,
but I think there's definitely also a lot of the way they were working,
the way Kay Reno, you know, another great music artist, has always been very suspicious, at the vanguard of the suspicion of, like, you know, he's like, the synthetic marijuana is like gonna destroy you, you know, like, they know.
But he only believes in, like, you know, organic marijuana.
I don't know, like, if he believes in organic marijuana. I'm not really sure. Like, the last time I checked, he was like actually like a preacher, like a Muslim preacher who like gave sermons at like some church, like, in wherever he lives. But he definitely, you know, has singled out like the synthetic government marijuana.
I think he means like hydroponic, like modern, like high THC weed, like, in general.
Maybe
is synthetic or something.
I guess. I'm not sure if he thinks, like, weed. You know, black, you know, the weed you buy in the black market. Yeah, exactly. GMO weed. I don't know what the fuck he's getting at.
Well, the other thing that, like, their work process that, like, around cocaine reminded me a lot of is kind of like amphetamines that are prescribed today, and how I don't know if you've ever experienced this. Like, I've certainly had legal encounters for years with, like, ADD medications, and you know, I think if you've ever known anybody, or if you yourself have ever, like, kind of like turned that dial up a little too hard to just power through something, like, there's that initial kind of like, oh yes, like, this is like the nitro boost that I needed. I'm so motivated. Oh, all my ideas are awesome. But, like, if you keep pressing that button over and over again, then it turns into, like, Don Henley, like, sitting over, like, the same, like, cymbal crash for, like, like a week, just like playing it over and over again. It's like, it's not perfect. And they're just, like, that's what Don Felder basically described. They all get coked out in the studio, and they would play whole takes that were like great or just fine, or, you know, even had like good improvisation, but like they were so obsessive about like the most unimportant shit about like, oh, like no, that echoes too much, like that voice echoes too much, we need to do it all again, and they like wasted tons of time just like on these like coked out rabbit holes of
things
like
that like
it
you couldn't
needs to
even
be
like really hear.
Like it sounded exactly the same to everybody else, but like you couldn't. You actually lose a little more objectivity in the long run from indulging in taking that approach to it. Exactly. You get songs like Teenage Jail that just sound like you're in hell. Like
well, basically like Vyvanse and stuff, like, you know, is kind of like meth, like more or less. It's just like legal. It's very similar to like legal meth. Obviously, it's not like quite the same.
I only
like,
quibble with that. I'd say like if you had like methamphetamine pills, then yes, you'd be correct. But like the method of ingestion counts a lot. I think like meth is much more intense. Like it's even like snorting cocaine versus smoking crack. Like one is going to be kind of exponentially like hit. You're even freebasing cocaine.
Yeah.
Like, it's going to hit you way harder. Just like popping an OxyContin pill and like snorting it and shooting it are like 3 different levels. They're all bad, you know, for the record. But it's kind of like that a little bit, where it's like molecularly, you're right. It's like not that. Maybe meth wouldn't be such a scourge if everyone just took meth pills.
Like methamphetamine pills, you know,
for certain
people.
disorders.
And
you know, if you're a Nazi Wehrmacht soldier in 1939, then you were getting prescribed meth pills. Kind of scary.
I don't know. Like Vyvanse, like it kind of, you know, I've been on Adderall, I've been on Vyvanse. I'm on like Vyvanse, like 40 milligrams right now. I feel like that's a little bit. Well, I feel like actually almost it's different where like now that I like take it more regularly. It's like, you know, maybe it's in that phase of like, you know, basically dependent on Vyvanse, you know, but
sure.
I don't know. I feel like if anybody has like ADHD, like I do, but like at the same time, like, you know, it definitely is something that like, you know, helps me to work. But again, like I am dependent upon it. But I feel like it's a little bit different. To me, even though it does come from like Big Pharma in the same way, like, and it's definitely sus, and I'm super glad that like I wasn't put on it as a kid, and that like my parents fought against it, even though like people suggested it, you know, like
same. I got it pushed on me when I was like in middle school, like come on, don't you want to take it? Come on, you know. But like my mom thought it was sus. I thought it was sus, and I'm glad.
I feel like, you know, it's like
Even Felder said
had, like,
when
a disorder, like, you know,
we had to
like keep up with like this fucking, you know, like I have to write like a fucking like 300-page dissertation, like, you know, in 1780 I had to like an 8-page dissertation or whatever. Like no one had Vyvanse then because they didn't have to fucking write 300-page dissertation. The guy who came up with the idea of game theory, like his dissertation was like 10 pages long or something.
Exactly. John Nash.
Pissed me off so much.
Even Don Felder, I don't know if you saw this, but he made a point near the end where his kid was having some behavioral issues. Like this probably was in like the 90s or something, and they took him to a psychologist, and they said he had ADD and like wanted to prescribe him Ritalin, and he like freaked out because he's like, I remember what speed was like on the road, and like the idea of like giving it to my 10-year-old was like horrifying. But then I decided to do it. But you know, it just shows that it's like an interesting like that was a generational weird like shift for him. It was like, what, you want to get my 10-year-old speed? Like I used to play speed, and we were doing like 5 shows a week.
Exactly.
Like, okay. He also said about just because it's in front of me right now, that one time he ran into like David Crosby. I think he was touring with like Crosby, like Stills and Nash, and he said he was the first person he'd ever met. He used excessive amounts of cocaine, and the energy that came off him in consequence was paranoid, tense, and fearful. I remember walking down the hallway in a motel we were staying in one night and seeing David's door open, so I strolled in. We were working together after all, and I'd hoped we were friends. Hey, how you doing? I said, thinking I could walk into his life the same way I could with Graham. On his bed, the suitcase was lying open, and inside was a bag of cocaine. David was really high, and the look on his face was one of paranoia. He'd been caught red-handed. There was no telling what he might do. Stiffening, I said, I forgot something. I gotta go. I only worked with him for a few months, but there was always a distance between us, and I never stopped being slightly wary. So it's like, sounds fun. After a while, yeah, the fun gets sucked out of it. But it's interesting to think about how they were really like pressured into the drug use as a result of the hectic nature of their schedule and kind of their work-life balance, if you will. I mean, I guess we're being extremely narcophobic right now, but if you think about it, like, that was a deal they made. But I think Felder, I think, is kind of the most eloquent and maybe like honest about his ambivalence about kind of going all the way with that, but still kind of feeling, he makes a good point, which is that if you're up late recording in the studio and you want to go a little further and like one person wants to do cocaine, that doesn't work. Because then in like an hour or two, like everyone's gonna be sleepy and bitter and mad. They're just like jumping around. So it's like exactly.
And
so like everybody has to be on the same page.
Yeah, and in terms of like being in a group, exactly. It just exacerbates all the tensions even more, where it causes like so much, where it just pours oil on the fire of like the acrimony like between the different members, because like you get like paranoid. I mean, coke is like really like a whole other level, but you can definitely I definitely felt like the parallels like with other shit, and like this is kind of unique to their situation, but it speaks to kind of like it was like a system that was sustaining these habits. It's like Joe Walsh like just sat like in the documentary that I watched, History of the Eagles, at your recommendation, a 4-hour documentary about the Eagles. You could hear clips of him and he just sounds like shit, like he's like slurring his words, like he was just had an alcohol problem and like a cocaine problem at that point,
and huge cocaine problem.
He's just a complete fucking mess. And
like, I don't know, man, you got some firecrackers, you just shove them up your butt and light them up,
yeah, exactly. Just like saying things like that in response to like totally irrelevant question, and no one said anything to him. They all just went along.
Everybody was like encouraging him. Like Irving Azoff bought him an electric chainsaw so it would be quiet and he could like sneak up on people and chainsaw through the door, like the walls in their hotels and shit like that. He was really, I don't know what he was kind of going through, but yeah, we're like about to Joe Walsh. But wait, real quick, we should talk about Bernie leaving after they make like One of These Nights, which has a lot of dope songs on it. Lion Eyes is a pretty dark anthem about Hollywood, I would say. Did you listen to Lion Eyes?
Yes, I did listen to Lion Eyes.
I think they won like Song of the Year at the Grammys for that one, and that was like kind of their last like real country-ish kind of track, and it's pretty great. They had the title track, One of These Nights, which I've heard some people describe as almost like kind of like country disco. Kind of interesting, kind of a haunted track.
Yeah, there was that weird thing that was a little bit later, but in the long run, where they like, they're like, we hate disco, like, and they made that song about the disco strangler.
Terrible song.
They're pretty big misogynists, I have to say. Not to cancel the Eagles for their misogyny, but it's understandable that they were like, back up.
That last album,
and then they were like, let's be in a band together, guys.
I don't know if it was like that. I don't know if them wanting to break off on their own was a result of like misogyny related to Linda Ronstadt, because they were like super tight with Linda Ronstadt.
Yeah,
she
true.
was like
she
totally down with them, and she made them kind of like, so they were always like. And also, like, talk about, feminist heroes, but like Don Henley, starting in like the mid to late 70s, like dated Stevie Nicks kind of on and off for 2 years, and they eventually did a duet together.
That was during the Love 'Em and Lear 'Em era of Don
Yes,
Henley.
the Love 'Em and Lear 'Em. But yeah, you're right. No, a lot of that stuff with like, groupie culture, there's no way to look at it, I think, today as anything else in this like bizarre, like Dionysian frenzied, like cult of like problematic bro gods, like with guitars.
Yeah.
Like, it's hard to really, I'm sure there's still groupies and stuff today, and that's still kind of like a phenomenon. I mean, a lot of it is probably also like blended with social media and stuff, but I take them kind of at their word of like the dynamics, especially the way Felder describes it, because he was married and initially like really didn't want to cheat on his wife.
he's tortured over like the temptations that like he was seduced by and like the hollow experiences that he had. Right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I appreciated his, because like Don and Glenn still kind of talk about it with like a smirk as like, yeah, we had fun, and it's like, like I don't know, like
Well, I mean,
it's just
like,
and like their third encore
like,
parties and stuff.
Again, it shows how like those two guys were like on a similar wavelength where they were like single and like not capable of having like any kind of while at the same time like writing songs about how like they're prisoners of their own freedom and everything, like they weren't able to like have any kind of like real relationship with anyone, and like just kind of like obviously like he shouldn't be exonerated for like what he did, and like he felt guilt about it rightly, but naturally for like betraying his like marriage vows and everything, but like he was in a situation where everyone around him was acting this way, like throwing so like,
and you really hate to see it, but Randy Meisner, who I believe married his like high school sweetheart when he was like 16, because he was also a very poor son of like sharecroppers from Nebraska.
Yeah, he just like disregarded the fact that he was married completely.
Yeah, he just decided to live like a double life, and then even though he would go back to Nebraska like in between tours and stuff, but that was a little, because otherwise like Randy is just like, he's really like the sweetheart of the group compared to at least these other guys. Like you really feel like, oh, like Randy was like the sensitive one, and like, but he was getting sucked into it too. It was really hard to basically avoid.
They're all guilty and like complicit, and that doesn't like exonerate them, but it is like a twisted, sick like culture and system. You can't exonerate that either. Especially Don Henley and Glenn Frey were really sucked into it, and we're really just like, I must be a rocker, like that's why I respect Bernie, because he like had the sense to get out. He did date Ronald Reagan's daughter, but she seemed like pretty chill compared to the other Reagans. They did disown her.
True,
I mean,
true.
Again, relative to the other Eagles, and he even, Don Felder just tell a story about one time he was like tapping some cocaine out of a vial or something, and he accidentally tapped out like too much, and he was like, well, I can't put it back, might as well snort it all. And Bernie was like, hey man, like watch out, like that will fucking destroy your life.
Yeah, you gotta be careful with that shit, man.
Yeah.
He was doing a lot of surfing and yoga, and he was like, he had become a vegetarian and was like eating healthy, and like,
the documentary
like,
kind of like made him like, because they were like doing all this cool stuff on their new album, and they're like, hey man, like what do you think, and he was like, I think I'm going surfing. And
then he really left for 3 days.
Like how dare he just reply to say he's going surfing? It's like, well,
that's true. That's true. They did cast him into just like, he's a little bit of like a angry, bitter kind of guy who just couldn't stand that like they weren't doing
I heard
country stuff anymore.
The documentary made it seem like Glenn Frey was just amped up about like all the excitement of being in the Eagles, and that's why he got beer poured in his head. But like the Don Felder account and like other accounts of the event are that like he was like attacking Bernie and saying like, this guy's a problem, like he's a liability, like screaming at him before like kind of provoking him to do it.
No, exactly. And it finally like exploded, and like he was like giving him shit and like really like disrespecting him in front of everybody, and he just walked up and like poured his long neck bud all over his face and said, you need to chill out, man.
Yeah,
like they almost got into like they came to blows almost, and they had to be like separated, and then he was pretty much done with it.
Yeah, that was
I listened to a more recent interview with him, and like he said that even when like Don Felder joined on like their third album, he felt like it was getting away from him, and that he might have to quit this band at some point in the future. And Don Felder also said he like, it was palpable how much he felt like he walked in and this band was about to break up in like 1973. Like they were totally unstable, and Don and Glenn were already kind of starting to assert their greater influence, which like the other two original guys were like, hey, what the fuck, like it was supposed to be all for one and one for all, man, and they didn't want to do it that way, so he like stormed out and then he quit, and so they were left like minus their number one country dude, and back to 4. Then like the dialectic reared its head again, because like they had a couple like hit things. They also had Take It to the Limit, which would also be like a very important song for their thing, which was like Randy Meisner's like first really big hit, where great song, honestly, I think so. You think so? You vibe with Take It to the Limit?
It's one of the, like, I like, you know, I get it kind of, like, I get it a little bit more than I did, maybe. I still don't quite understand, like, why you love the Eagles so much. Like, I probably never will, but it's okay. Like, you know, it's not bad.
It's a good balance. Also, just, like, Randy Meisner's voice.
Yeah, right,
and
you know, his falsetto, you know, he does have a great falsetto, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you really have to listen to, like, the live version where he hits the high note at the end, which became, like, a huge, like, point of, like, contention, like, later on, to like an extreme degree.
Right,
but,
yeah, because he wouldn't
like,
hit the high note because he got bored. I mean, which, you know, is like really like a thing, like having to do that like every single day is perform the same songs. Like, I've always wondered how people do that. Like, you know, it's kind of like being in one of these Broadway shows like Phantom of the Opera or like Wicked, you know, or something like that, where like all these like drooling, like, you know, fleshy faced tourists like come in and like you have to do the high note every day. Yeah, exactly. And it's just like, do it again.
Do it again,
I
monkey.
used to work at a theater where they had Audra McDonald and Porgy and Bess, and my boss at the time, like, I remember him like complaining about how like someone in the ensemble wouldn't like hit the high note or like do this like riff they really liked, you know, like every performance or whatever. And it's like, shut the fuck, you know, like, so
I know,
you like, yeah, I mean, I understand, like, you know, and again, the documentary, they're like, I get it, you know, Randy, I understand, you know, I don't like singing these songs every single night, but the fans have waited their whole lives, you know, well, like
oh my god, as if singing Peaceful Easy Feeling is like as difficult as singing Take It to the Limit. Like, shut up, Glenn.
Yeah,
you know, like those songs, he sings in like a mid-range,
so much fucking
like
cocaine and alcohol. It's just like not healthy, like, you know, that's not good for you as like a performer, like, or like basically like that type of performing is like a physical, like, athletic thing almost, you know, like you have to, your body is your instrument, you know, in a way. So like when you're like abusing your body so heavily with all these different fucking substances, like it's hard as hell, you know. So
it really is. It is. And unfortunately, like right after, I think Felder described, like after Bernie left, that's when they kind of started like picking on Randy. Glenn Frey always felt like somebody was a problem, and like his laser focus would go, at first it was on Bernie, like Bernie's a problem, and then he left, and then it was like, oh, Randy's being a problem.
Yeah,
but,
it's just like the imaginary, like, it's really like a satanic like situation, because like it's completely irrational, and it really is like, you know, oh, the hi-hat is like echoing or whatever, you know, like there's always gonna be like an echoing hi-hat, like you know, you're never gonna really make the echo go away. So like you think you solve the problem like with the larger group, but like, you know, it's they're like, until you are yourself like alone and a prisoner like of your own freedom, you know, it's always gonna happen. But
but the vibes start to get darker. They got a lot of attention for this album, but like the drugs are like kicking up. One little funny like anecdote Felder said was you know, because he would end up like drinking, doing coke, like smoking weed, and then have to drive back to like Topanga Canyon like at 3 a.m, which I guess was like dangerous. And so he said he started sleeping over at the studio. The first night I stayed, I can't even remember going to bed, but when I woke up in the morning, I thought I'd died and gone to hell. The particular room I'd crashed in had an S&M theme with a leather headboard, whips, chains, and a cage hanging from the ceiling. I stared up at it all, blinking hard. What on earth did I take last night? I asked myself. So like that was like the cool film, a studio that I think was set up by Geffen, that had like an S&M room in it, and just like sounded so totally grody and disgusting and bizarre, you know. But then, okay, so they're getting attention. In September 1975, they got on the cover of Rolling Stone. Felder said there was a front page photograph of us all looking cool on a yacht in Chicago, wearing aviator sunglasses, and an article raving about how great we were. With typical media perversity, however, in the back of the same issue, there was a formal record review panning our new album. For some critics, we were ballad heavy and theatrically boring. We didn't have fireworks or makeup like Kiss, whose album Alive had sparked Kiss mania. Fans could buy everything from Kiss makeup to Kiss endorsed pinball machines. We didn't leap around on stage and smash guitars like The Who, or dress up in outrageous costumes like Elton John. The critics were missing the point. The Eagles were always about songwriting and song power, reaching people and touching their hearts with words and music that meant something. We wanted our songs to endure. Compare any Eagles verses to the repetitive, head-banging lyrics by some of these, quote, rock opera bands. We didn't need gimmicks, nor did we need to sell lunchboxes with our faces on them. So it's like, he's saying that, like, we were, like, you know, a Winslow Leach, not, like, a Beef, basically. But Swan, who actually, Irving Ossoff, by the way, was like 4'11", so he even has that in common with Swan from Phantom of the Paradise.
Right, yes.
But it seems like he really was opening up that suitcase and going, time for breakfast, here's more drugs. Right. And so after that Rolling Stone thing where they felt like they got burned, they instituted a new policy where interviews were kept to a bare minimum, or strictly controlled by Irving, Don, and Glenn.
Policy. Yeah, you can definitely see the totalitarian, authoritarian Stalinism of the Eagles coming out in this. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and just because we mentioned Meyer Lansky earlier, just want to throw this in. Around this time, when they were doing an American tour for one of these nights, they had a week off, so they decided to fly to Nassau in the Bahamas and get some rest. And like my radar just started like shooting off. In the documentary, when they mentioned we went down to the Bahamas, I was like, where in the Bahamas? Because you know what I'm thinking, right? And guess what? Like Felder confirmed it. We've been flying around and dashing here and there in rental cars. We were exhausted. It made sense to stay out on the road rather than fly home, unpack and repack. So we chartered a Learjet out of North Carolina and slipped down to a place in the Caribbean called Paradise Island. And so, what better place for Irving Azoff of Warner Communications to take them than Meyer Lansky's casino? Interesting. Right. And I guess they almost got caught with drugs by the customs. And actually, Felder says that when we arrived at Nassau's airport, customs officials greeted us with some suspicion, but then they were let through. And in the documentary, they say Irving Azoff, like they were about to like catch Glenn with like a bunch of weed and pills and stuff, and they like spilled pills all over the plane, on the floor, and it was like a total mess. And then Irving Azoff like went and had a word with one of the customs people, and then they were just let through. Right. So like, got a lot of juice on that island, on Paradise Island, I suppose. So that's just an interesting data point. Just like Candy Jones and Donald Trump and all these other people just hovering around Paradise Island. Yeah, very interesting.
Well, but they so far have not had to kiss that island goodbye, despite calling it paradise. So
no, they haven't had to. You're right. They built up a bunch of ugly casinos and satanic mobsters bought them. Not really satanic, but you know what I mean. They went on this tour, and then I think it was like during the one of these nights tour that Bernie was like, fuck this, and he quit. So they needed somebody else. So they went to somebody that Irving Azoff already represented, which was Joe Walsh, and they decided to plug him in and make him an Eagle. And so then the Hotel California lineup was secure at that point. And so you had Randy Meisner, Don Felder, Don Henley, Glenn Frey, and Joe Walsh, who already had like a solo career and was known. And I guess like they just basically doubled down on like, we need more rock. And I think it's a slight loss of Bernie's voice, because he had such a smooth like harmony contribution to their vocals. And as I impersonated Joe Walsh, and
he's very like this, man, and he even kind of sings like that, and
like he's very reedy, kind of nasally voice. I think he did pretty well, like singing Seven Bridges Road and stuff. Like I think it worked, and he was also like a really amazing guitarist and could also play keyboard and all these other things. So like he worked. And then I guess like you could kind of debate whether or not this is really the supreme form of the Eagles, the Hotel California lineup. I would say yes, or the one right before it, because I kind of like Bernie more. But regardless, they were primed to rock after this.
They were ready to rock. And they were in the fast lane.
They were. I mean, the story about how they came up with like the lyrics to that song is the most archetypal like boomer like story. It's the most archetypal Glenn Frey story probably ever. They were going to an Eagles poker game, and he was riding there in a red Corvette driven by his drug dealer, and they were holding big time, and he got into the far left lane on the freeway and started going like 95 miles per hour with a bunch of drugs. And Glenn Frey looked at him and, hey man, what are you doing? And the guy looked at him and like grinned devilishly and said, life in the fast lane. And then Glenn Frey was like, immediately I thought, That's a song.
Yeah, exactly. That's the song title. Yeah, exactly.
Like hilarious.
Yeah. He was riding in the field with a drug dealer known as the Count. Dracula. Talking about a little bit of Dracularity going on here.
Scary.
Slow down. What do you mean? It's slow in the fast lane. Yeah,
like in the fast lane.
My girlfriend, like during, I made her watch the 4-hour Eagles documentary, which like she was not 100% happy about, because like there's a lot of just like the same songs playing over and over, like in this concert footage and everything, and like there's this one like kind of like well there's a Hotel California-esque moment where like it ends basically, like the credits roll. And then like it just keeps going, and she was like, the credits rolled, and I was like, you can check it anytime you like, but you can never leave.
Yep, you can never leave. They had to put up that title card that said like Eagles are Don Henley, Glenn Frey, Joe Walsh, and Timothy Schmidt, and not Don Felder. Before you went into part 2, just to really emphasize that. Who is not an Eagle.
Right, yeah. A
lot of weird stuff like that in the documentary.
Yeah, she pointed out that, like, a lot of their songs, like, their song titles are just, like, kind of, like, sayings or, like, cliches, like, Take It to the Limit, Life in the Fast Lane, Take It Easy.
Lionize.
Like, yeah, it's a thing.
Yeah.
But,
I mean,
there's a lot
sure,
that's common to many musicians, Taylor Swift, the Eagles of today, directly in their lineage, referencing, Out of the Woods. Not a very good song, a shit song, but Champagne Problems, pretty good song.
Champagne Problems, exactly. But the Last Resort, obviously. I mean, they're just being literary. Right. It's okay.
But Last Resort's interesting because there's like a kind of interesting double entendre in the song.
Resort, you're right, because it's a resort. Yeah.
Right.
There is.
Yeah.
Open up your eyes, take the devil from your mind. He's been holding on to you, and you're so hard to find. The wind outside is cold, restless feeling in my soul, tempting me to get away, but there's no place a man can